All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. We are here to talk about the Small Farm Water Access Community Meeting that you all have signed up to be a part of tonight. My name is Alice Morrison. I am the co-executive director of Friends of Family Farmers, and I focus on our policy and development programs. And yeah, I'm here to talk with you about an issue that we have heard lots and lots and lots of feedback from our community on, and this presentation is to address that. So we have some ground rules tonight. Just want to contextualize what we're going to do. This presentation is being recorded, and we are going to post it on the FOF website. And because we're making a recording of this workshop, we are going to save questions until the end so we can turn the recording off for Q&A. So please do write down your questions, or if you put them in the chat during the presentation, my colleague Brittany, our community engagement director, is Brittany Deming. Wait, Brittany is going to be monitoring the chat box, and she will be pulling out any questions that you put in there to make sure that we answer those during the Q&A period. But we are going to save questions for the end so that the recording can be turned off at that time. The target audience of this presentation tonight is small farmers and those who serve them. The primary purpose of these presentations is to discuss domestic exempt well use and commercial agriculture and water rights and how to navigate that system for your own farm water supply plan and risk management strategies. And we will be touching on lots of topics related to how to navigate OWRD system, how to evaluate your water rights. We're going to talk about transfers and current exemptions and strategies for building exempt systems and some community resources. Number 3 is that we know that lots of people are coming to this topic from different places, and please listen to understand. If you have questions, please do put them in the chat or save them for the Q&A period at the end, and we will be sure to answer all questions that we have answers for. And if we don't have the answer, we're more than happy to help you find that resource. The last ground rule is that we know from our experience working on this topic that some folks are caught by surprise by the information in this presentation. And if you find out during this presentation that you might need to reevaluate your water supply choices and what you've got going on at your farm, and you're not comfortable speaking up about your particular situation, my contact information will be on the last slide of the presentation. And please feel free to get in touch, and we can set up a time to talk individually if that's more comfortable for you than speaking up in the Q&A section. All right, so an overview of what we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to just touch on briefly who Friends of Family Farmers is, who we are, and why we're talking to you about this. Then we're going to, the bulk of the presentation is in the second section. What is the current law? What is allowed? What is not allowed when it comes to using water for commercial purposes? And then the third topic that we're going to be covering tonight is what can you do? So there's options and resources for exempt systems and technical assistance. And then the last thing we're going to discuss is getting some feedback on some possible legislative solutions that FOF is currently exploring for the 2025 session. And we really want your feedback on some of the ideas that we have to propose some change. So without further ado, we are going to go into our brief introduction of Friends of Family Farmers. So Friends of Family Farmers is a statewide nonprofit organization. We have been around since 2005. This is our mission statement here on the slide. We represent 1,600 small and mid-sized, highly diversified local market farmers around the state. In addition to our advocacy work, which you'll hear a little bit about tonight, we operate 2 permanent farmer technical assistance programs. The first of which is Oregon Pasture Network. That is a community of practice and marketing platform for pasture-based livestock folks. So if you are raising animals on pasture and you want to connect with like-minded producers, find a peer-to-peer learning network, we have a mentorship program. We offer pasture walks around the state, as well as education courses, both online and in person, on all topics from like animal husbandry and when, how to evaluate an animal health emergency and when to call the vet. We have a class on that in our archive, all the way to like organic compliant parasite management and how to develop your, emergency evacuation plan for your livestock. So all kinds of topics that relate to pasture-based livestock producers at the Oregon Pasture Network. You can find it at OregonPastureNetwork.org. Also, if you are not a livestock producer and you want to find one that aligns with your values and you'd like to purchase meat from, go on over to OregonPastureNetwork.org and use our pastured product guide. You can type in your zip code and find folks in your area. The other permanent technical assistance program that we operate is Oregon FarmLink. Oregon FarmLink is a land access program that's been around for about a decade. And primarily, it is a platform where you can list yourself as a land seeker or a land holder and find either the right land for your farm business or the right person to take over stewardship of your land through leasing or sale, to pass on your farmland to the next generation of farmers. We also, within Oregon FarmLink, have a one-on-one technical assistance program that we call the Navigate program, which provides individual coaching to land seekers, help you make an individual land seeking plan, what steps you're going to need to take in your land access journey. We can help you prepare for things like grant and loan applications. We can give you some subsidized access to experts like lawyers and surveyors and some of those things that help you through your land access journey. We do have spots available in the Navigate program, and we recently opened that statewide. So if you are looking for land for your farm business, it doesn't have to be a new farm business. You could be expanding an existing farm business. Please head on over to OregonFarmLink.org and apply for the Navigate program. We'd highly encourage you. All right. We have been conducting lots of community meetings on this topic. So I believe that, what is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. This is the number 16 of our community meeting series. And we have had more than 450 people come out to discuss this topic over the last several months. We've been receiving a lot of inquiries about this topic in general, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. But we'd really like to thank the Grange community and some of these other communities mentioned in this list for hosting us in these in-person meetings that we've been having around the state. And thank you all for joining our statewide virtual meeting as well. And we do have one more in-person meeting scheduled. We are going to be at the Spencer Creek Grange in South Eugene next Tuesday, October 29th at 6:30 p.m. So if you're in that area and you have more questions after this presentation, or you have friends or family or loved ones in that area who would benefit from this, please do encourage them to attend. It's open to everyone. All right. So now we're going to get into the section that I'm sure you are all here for. What is the current law surrounding domestic exempt well use and commercial purposes? So since 1955, the 1955 Groundwater Act is the most recent in this iteration. Water rights were first established, I think, back in about 1907. In 1927 was the first time that they were required, but only east of the Cascades. And in 1955, the 1955 Groundwater Act expanded that requirement to the entire state, and that every person who is growing a crop intentionally for sale, so applying water to a plant that you intend to sell, or applying water to a plant that is eaten by an animal that you intend to sell, you needed a water right to do that with some limited exemptions that we're going to talk about in a moment. Water rights in this state are granted by the Oregon Department of Water Resources. So they are going to be, Oregon Water Resources Department is, actually, I got that slightly wrong because I'm going to refer to them as OWRD for the rest of this presentation. They are tied to the property, not to the owner. So if you are the owner of a property that has water rights, you can make changes to those water rights during your time as the owner of that property. But if you sell that property to someone else, that water right stays with it's a deeded right of that property. You don't get to take it with you. They are governed by the doctrine of prior appropriation. So this is really the basis for a lot of the water law in Oregon. Doctrine of prior appropriation means that water rights are not actually a guarantee of water. They are a place in line if that water right is available. So, or if that water is available. So if you have a water right, it has a date, a priority date attached to it. And this is where we get into junior and senior water rights. That is actually a relative term. I know sometimes people talk broadly about senior water rights versus junior water rights, but your water right is always going to be senior to someone and junior to someone else, unless you have the oldest water right in the state or the very newest. So when we talk about that, that is just your place in line and what priority date is assigned to your water right. Many times when folks are talking about junior and senior water rights broadly, they are talking about prior to and after the early 1960s, right? About like 1963-ish, because that is when in-stream water rights became a thing, and many in-stream water rights were granted during that time in the early 1960s. And so an in-stream water right is a water right for surface water that belongs to the stream itself. So I'm sure some of you who have surface water rights are familiar with this concept, because if that water drops below the CFS of that in-stream water right, no one else can take water out of that stream because the stream itself has a right to have a certain amount of water in it. So that when we're talking about junior and senior broadly, it's often that early 1960s date that people are really talking about. Not always, though. So somebody might make a more specific claim. We are going to talk about how to look up your property's water right and interpret the OWRD system in just a moment. So I wanted to clarify also that when we're talking about exempt wells, we are talking about domestic wells. So domestic wells are wells that were drilled for the purpose of serving a home and home use. And as you can see from this graph from Oregon Water Resources Department, the vast majority of wells in Oregon are domestic wells. 88% of the total number of wells are domestic in this state. So there's quite a few of them. There's a couple 100,000 domestic exempt wells in the state. Excuse me. And you can see that irrigation, that is wells that have an irrigation water right assigned to them. That is a much lower percentage of the total wells in Oregon. That's only 7% of wells in Oregon. When we're talking about community, that is like municipalities that have community water sources. And this graph only refers to groundwater. So many communities do use surface water sources. So we're not saying that all communities in Oregon, municipal water sources only use 10% of the water in Oregon. This is groundwater only. It does not account for surface water. But 1% of the wells in Oregon are for community use. Then you can get special livestock permits, special industrial permits, and this other category is kind of a just a margin of error in the system. You can see it's 3% on both sides. So then we go over to these red bars, and this is the percentage of use. So this is an estimation from the Oregon Water Resources Department. Because we don't currently require metering on domestic exempt wells, there is not accurate data associated with them. We want to acknowledge that. But the estimation from the Oregon Water Resources Department, based on everything that they know, is that this whole 88% of wells, of the number of wells in the state, uses 4% of the groundwater that is pumped out of the ground for any reason. On the flip side, we see that these 7% of wells that have an irrigation water right associated with them, they pump 82% of the water out of the ground. Any groundwater that is pumped out of the ground for any reason, 82% of that is for deeded irrigation water rights, according to the Oregon Water Resources Department. These community wells that are feeding municipal water systems, those account for 10% of usage, and livestock and industrial are pretty negligible in the scheme of things. So when we're talking about domestic exempt wells, we are talking about this column over here. So a vast number of wells, but a very low usage point in the OWRD statistics. So, but given what I just told you about, since 1955, you have had to have a water right in order to grow a crop intentionally for sale using irrigated agriculture. And OWRD has recently stepped up enforcement. About a year ago, that became a priority of the department to crack down on commercial usage of domestic exempt wells. So folks who are using those domestic exempt wells for irrigated agriculture without a water right. In recent memory, this has been a complaint-driven process. Like I said, it has technically, this is not a new law. I think there was some consternation earlier this year when this became a point of contention. This is not a new law or even a new interpretation of the law. There was no rulemaking process that made this happen. It is just a change in enforcement practice. This used to be a complaint-driven process. And so many folks weren't aware of the law because their water use was not posing a problem to their neighbors, where they would make a complaint and OWRD would have to address it. OWRD has received additional capacity and powers to combat the ongoing drought. We are in a period of drought in Oregon, and in order to address that, OWRD has faced pressure to crack down on illegal water usage in the state. Um, Unfortunately, that has meant that they have decided to prioritize going after these small users, um, instead of retooling the system of water rights holders, which uses the majority of the water in the state. It's where we are right now. And OWRD has identified this as a priority and is employing proactive tactics to find this type of user. And by this type of user, I mean domestic exempt well users who are irrigating for commercial purposes. So that's why we're here today. We want to give everybody on this call the tools to make decisions for your farm business or to help the farmers that you serve make decisions for their farm business that will help you stay legal and manage your risk when it comes to your water supply. So the first thing that we're going to talk about today is how to look up your property's water rights in the OWRD system and how to interpret what they've got going on. There are two tools that OWRD has available. This tool over here, the Water Rights Information System, is the older tool. Honestly, it's kind of complicated and difficult to use. They just released the Water Rights Mapping tool last year, and we're going to go over how to use the Water Rights Mapping tool in this presentation. Also, if you just type into a search engine, Oregon Water Rights Mapping tool, this will be the first thing that comes up. So it's a GIS tool. Their search engine optimization is pretty good. You can find this easily using any search engine. So when we talk about the mapping tool, you are trying to identify a tax lot associated with a water right. And so this is kind of the intro here. But when you first come into this space, you are going to see this blank page. And then you're going to go up here to this box and type in your address. But keep in mind that many water rights were granted before the current street names, street numbers, sometimes new roads are built. So the way that the water right is situated on your tax lot might not exactly follow the lines of what you have going on now. So having the ability to compare your physical space to this map is really important. So you type it in, it gives you an approximation of where you think this is going to be. Then what you're going to do is you're going to go over here to this blue icon where it says draw box on map. You're going to click that blue icon and you're going to draw a box on the map. I would encourage you, if you suspect or you know that your property has surface water rights, as opposed to groundwater rights, if you have surface water rights, I would make that box pretty big, because if your property used to be part of a larger farm, if it's been subdivided over the years, and your water right is a surface water right, it oftentimes divides that water right. It's kind of default. You can have different arrangements if you specify in the purchase agreement, but usually what happens is you divide that water right according to how many acres of the application area goes to each parcel. But it doesn't necessarily move your point of diversion. So like the place you put the pump in the river. So if you have a surface water right, I would make this box pretty big. And as you can see here, this little area that we're looking at here actually has 2 water rights associated with it. So we highlighted this purple box by typing in the address, and then we got these blue lines, which are the outlines of the water right based on our draw box on map. And so you can see that there are 2 things to pay attention to on the map for your water right as these little blue dots. These are your points of diversion. And this outline of blue here is the area of application. These are very important because you have to have your point of diversion and your area of application correct on this map with OWRD's information and files, or you can be given an enforcement action because you're not applying your water in the right place, or you're taking water from a place that is not your designated point of diversion. So keep that in mind. But when we're interpreting what this map means, you can see that you have 2 water rights down here. This larger water right is the first one, and that is Mr. Oscar E. Williams applied for an irrigation water right in 1959. And this also has your CFS, your cubic feet per second, so the flow rate that you are allowed to take. And you can see if I had scrolled over further, you would have your total acre feet that you're allowed. So an acre foot is the amount of water that it takes to submerge 1 acre in 1 foot of water. So I think it's about like comes out to be 30 something, 32,000 gallons or so. But pay attention to these numbers, especially if you're upgrading your equipment. It is not necessary for you to invest in a better, like a pump that could do so much more than the CFS that you are allowed to take. And if you are using a pump that is too powerful for your water rate and taking more water than you are allowed to have, that could also lead to an enforcement action. So please do keep that in mind that you're using the correct amount of water. Also, as you can see, this property has 2 water rights. So these little areas on the sides here, that is a supplemental irrigation water right. And what probably happened here, this is a little bit of conjecture, but Mr. Oscar E. Williams, he put in this request, this application proposed for a water right for this majority portion of his property, and then maybe cleared this area and this area, or obtained this land from some neighbors and decided, that's arable land. I would like to irrigate that as well, and applied for a supplemental irrigation water right in 1967. So your priority dates, like we said, those are important to remember. And also, if you scroll all the way over, there's some additional information about when you're allowed to use that water. There are dates associated, like calendar dates. It's usually January 1st to December 31st, but sometimes it can be April to October. And if that's the case, please pay attention to that, because if you are, watering your plant starts in the greenhouse in February, you're technically violating your water right because if it starts in April. So keep that in mind when you're making your decisions. So when you click on this, when you get to this page, you can get your water rights information system. So that's the other QR code that was on that slide a couple times ago. You can get your details here. You can get your water rights map, the original map that was made, and you have your certificate number, which is helpful if you are, trying to get legal documentation of your water right, easements, things like that are associated with it. And you can look up more information in the WRIS details section. So when you're interpreting this information, there are some things to keep in mind. This right is going to be listed with the person's name who first applied for the right, not the person who currently owns the property. I've had people during these presentations come to me and say, it was never transferred over to me when we bought the property. I understand why you might be freaked out to see a previous owner's name. It doesn't mean that you're not allowed to use the right. It just means that that right is documented by the person who applied for it. It is deeded to the property, so it doesn't really matter whose name is on that. As long as you are the current owner of the property, you are allowed to use that right. Some rights only have certain months that you can access that water, and I just talked about that a little bit. Sometimes you have only a right that can be used in the high season, so make sure to check on that. The rights associated with a single point of diversion and specific areas of application. If you want to change those, you do need to get permission and file paperwork with OWRD. Your point of diversion for surface water rights is going to be the place where you are supposed to put your pump into the surface water source. And your point of diversion for a groundwater right is going to be the well that you are using. So if you are changing that, if you're drilling a new well, if you want to move your pump up or down the river, you do need to file some paperwork with OWRD and get that point of diversion changed. Because if those do not line up with reality from their records to what you're doing, you can get an enforcement action, and we would hate to see that. So rights listed in the system are not necessarily active. If so, this is that use it or lose it thing that people talk about with water rights, is that you have to have proof that they have been used for a beneficial purpose in the last 5 years. But there is not capacity at OWRD to go out and check every single water right on a 5-year basis. So really what that means is that if you want to make changes, or you want to initiate a transfer, or change your point of diversion or area of application, or file new paperwork with your with OWRD for any reason about that water right, you have to have proof that it has been used for a beneficial use in the last 5 years. So keep that in mind. Um, and when you're looking at it, if you go into the water rights information system, it will have a status listed. And because they don't check on your water right every 5 years, there's not someone coming out and checking on every single water right in Oregon. Non-canceled is the default designation. So that's actually a good thing. If you look at your water right and it says non-canceled, that's a great thing. That means your water right, you can use that. If it says canceled, that means something bad happened. There was a complaint made, it was canceled for a cause. That means that water right, you cannot use that. And I've been told that it's very difficult to revive a canceled water right. So non-canceled looks scary at first, but is the default designation when we're talking about water rights. And if you see that on your water right, go ahead and use it. So if your property has a water right, make sure you know your points of diversion and areas of application. I'm saying this a million times because we have heard a lot of folks, that is part of the enforcement that we've seen. And we've seen people who are not doing anything else wrong. They're using the correct amount of water. They have a water right, but their area of application and point of diversion are different than they should be. And you do have to clear that up. And we don't want folks to get hung up in the bureaucracy for that reason. So please be aware of that. And note that you have to have proof of beneficial use in the last 5 years in order to make that change. So if you purchased a property that has water rights, or you are leasing from someone who says that they have water rights, there should be documentation. And it is a really good idea to see that and make sure that you all are all on the same page about what the water situation is, how much you're allowed to be using, where you're allowed to be putting it, and when you are allowed to use it. So please do see that documentation if you are leasing from someone, to make sure that everybody, because it would be a real shame. And I've known people in the situation where it's the middle of August, water rights department shows up and asks you what the water situation is. You say, my landlord has told me that we have a water right and that I'm using it legally. Here's what she said in my lease. And it turns out that that's not true. And that really falls back onto the leaseholder, that then they have to stop production because there wasn't legal access to water on the property. So if you are in a situation where you're trying to negotiate a lease, check out the Oregon FarmLink Navigate program. We can help you with that conversation, or to prepare you for that, to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what you can and can't do on the property. If your property does not have a water right, get to know exemptions. We're going to talk a lot about exemptions. And I think that is the area where folks are going to have the most questions. So please do put them in the chat or save them up for the Q&A section at the end. But get to know exemptions. Then think about how to transition away from irrigation. We're going to have some technical assistance options. And then also you can think about what you can do with the resources that are at your property. And then we're going to talk about transfers, because do your neighbors have an unused water right? Water right transfers can be a great option. We are going to discuss applying for new water rights and the different types of water rights that you can apply for. But I would highly encourage you to look into transfers before applying for a new water right. And we'll talk about why in a little while. Okay. So the exemptions in the current law, and so when I say exemptions, I mean these are the things that are written in statute as legal exempt uses for domestic well water. So if you have a domestic well, this does not apply to surface water. This is only for domestic wells. But if you have a domestic well that does not have a water right attached to it, this is what you are allowed to use that water for in the statute. And this is for the first time you pump it out of the ground, initial pumping that water out of the ground. These are the uses that you can do with your domestic exempt well. The first one is a half-acre non-commercial garden. So you are allowed to irrigate a half acre for any purpose you want. You could grow flowers, you could grow food, you could grow a lawn if you wanted, as long as that is non-commercial. So that half acre, there's not a sales threshold associated with that. It is any commercial activity. So, for example, if you're growing a bunch of food for yourself and your neighbors, you are allowed to eat that food yourself. You are allowed to give it away. You are allowed to give it to the food bank or the local food pantry. You are allowed to barter with your neighbors to a reasonable extent. But if you exchange currency for a squash or something like that, that is not a legal use of your domestic exempt well water. You can, however, use 5,000 gallons per day for a single commercial or industrial use, except that commercial use cannot be irrigated agriculture. It is the only exemption in that commercial use that's outlined in the statute. It literally says any single commercial or industrial use except irrigated agriculture. So any other commercial purpose, and I get a lot of questions about like what that commercial purpose might be. Most farms do use the 5,000 gallon per day commercial use on their farm for domestic well water in some way, shape, or form, probably not that whole amount. But thinking about where your wash and pack is, and most of the time, your irrigation water, if it's on a different well than your home, that's not going to meet the food safety standards that you need for potable water to be washing your vegetables and things like that. And it's also usually not an acceptable use of irrigation water to be washing and prepping your vegetables for market. So thinking about that, there are pretty much all farms in Oregon do use this commercial use portion to a small extent to prepare your produce for sale at the farmers market, CSA, retail, whatever you're doing. And also thinking about things like the farm direct producer process exemption. If you're making pickles and you're using water in your pickle brine, that is a commercial use. Of course, there are non-farm commercial uses. Like, for example, if you had a licensed preschool facility at your home, the water you use for that commercial purpose for the preschool activities, that would fall under that commercial usage. If you We've heard the example, if you had a car wash, you would be able to use 5,000 gallons per day to wash cars for a commercial purpose, but you cannot use that for irrigation. And that includes pasture irrigation. It's not just row crops and annual crops or whatever crops you want. You could be watering your perennials, but crops as well as pasture fall under that line item exclusion for irrigation. But stock water. So currently, stock water, which means the water that animals drink in order to satiate their thirst, that is allowed from domestic exempt well water. You can fill your troughs from your domestic well for your animals to drink, as long as you are not watering the pasture that they eat. You can give them the water that they need to drink. So we get this question a lot about like people who might have a sign out front of their house that says like eggs, $7, call this number or something. Technically, those folks, because they're feeding the chickens, well, they're probably not getting all of their sustenance from irrigated pasture. They're probably feeding them something. And those are stock. You're watering the stock. So that egg product is probably legal. But if you were selling a zucchini at a roadside stand next to and you're using domestic exempt well water, that zucchini that's not a legal product. But so just want to get through some of the common questions that I get about these exemptions. There is no limit on stock water. Neither is there a limit on the half-acre non-commercial garden right now. The only limit on stock water is if you had a CAFO permit, a confined animal feeding operation permit, you would have to limit that to 12,000 gallons per day. But if you had a CAFO permit, you would know. They're difficult to get and expensive to maintain, and they're usually for larger operations. And if you don't know if you have one, then you don't have one. You are allowed to use 15,000 gallons per day for domestic use. So that just means like humans living, just drinking water, appliances, showers, all that kind of thing. And that does sound like a high number, but this number has been stood up in court a couple times because there are places in the state where there are multiple households operating off of a single domestic well, and that's why that number has stood the test of time, because all of these numbers are per domestic well, not per household. So when you have a situation where 2 or 3 or 4 households are operating off of a single domestic well, that 15,000 gallons gets spread out pretty quickly. If you are a school, you can water grounds of up to 10 acres. That's usually for like sports fields and areas around schools, without a water right. So that is something that is universal, but a lot of schools are within city limits and therefore are using municipal water. But for rural schools that have their own well, you are allowed to be watering up to 10 acres for school usage. I do want to clarify that we have heard throughout these community meetings that you do need to be careful about your school gardens and whether or not you have a fundraiser associated with those. We did have somebody from a school district in Lane County come to one of our community meetings and tell us that because they had a career and technical education program around their greenhouse initiative in their school garden, and they were doing some plant sales, and they were doing plant sales to promote the program, and then they were asked to get a water right because that's commercial activity. So generally, watering of school grounds is considered an exempt use. But if you have commercial activity associated with that, even if it's like a fundraiser for the school program, you could be asked to get a water right. So just bear that in mind. And fire suppression emergencies are an exempt use. I really want to urge everybody listening here tonight that if you are being told something by your fire authority, do not consider OWRD when you are choosing whether or not to like put water onto the roof of your house to prevent it from burning down from a fire or a wildfire that's encroaching on you. That kind of thing. Please listen to your fire authorities. If they're telling you to do something, you should do it. So these are the exemptions in current law that you can use domestic exempt well water for. That's the first time you pump it out of the ground. We're going to talk about water recycling in a moment, but these are the ways that you are allowed to use domestic exempt well water without a water right. Okay, so these are things that are not explicitly said in the statute. All those things that I just talked about, the exemptions, are explicitly listed in the statute, but these are things that are allowed, that you do not need a water right for, that are part of rules and things that you're allowed to do that are not explicitly addressed in the statute. Recycling water. So if you are first pumping that water out of the ground for a qualified exempt use, you can recycle that. So if you have a gray water system for your house, I mean, keep in mind what, detergents or soaps or whatever you're using in your home, in showers and dishwasher and whatever, laundry, all that kind of thing. That could have an impact on your irrigation water, but you are allowed to collect gray water from your house, store that water, and apply it as commercial irrigation water for a commercial garden if it was first pumped out of the ground for a qualified exempt use, like domestic use. I say be reasonable here because I've had some folks at some of our meetings come up with some pretty creative solutions, including like leaving showers on all day or setting up your wash and pack to spray one carrot all day and then collecting all that water. That is a judgment call that your water resources department employee who comes out to see you is allowed to make. So please be reasonable and understand that the person who comes to inspect you is often the person who is making the call about whether or not your water use is valid. So if you try to get around them, they might get you. So, it's their job. That's what they're here to do. But just making sure that you understand that a qualified exempt use, there can be some interpretation there. Irrigating from metered city water sources. So if you are within the city limits, if you are an urban farmer and you are paying a water bill every month, that is legal for irrigation of commercial crops because cities have water rights. Cities are one of the few things that have a water right that they're allowed to sell the water to someone else in a piecemeal basis, like a water company. And so, if you are buying water via your monthly bill, you are allowed to use that for commercial irrigation. I do have to mention that cities do have their own rules about how much you can use. So if you're using a certain amount that is considered too much for the municipal code, or if there is a zoning issue for you having a commercial agricultural enterprise in whatever zoning that you have within your city, that could be an issue. But in general, your water usage is not the problem there. It could be a different source in the municipal code that there could be a problem with. So keep that in mind. Okay, using spring water. So springs are something that when I started giving these presentations, I thought were a lot simpler than it turns out that they are. So you have to make sure that your spring, if you want to use springs as your primary source of commercial irrigation, that spring cannot form a channel or flow off your property at any point during the year. And also, we are hearing now that there are some folks who have been using springs for a long time, but that they are getting investigations from from OWRD because they're also saying that springs cannot be improved. So if that spring has a pipe stuck in it, there's a concrete cistern around that spring, or you've done some earth moving to keep that spring from forming a channel, that could be considered improvement and would disqualify your spring for commercial use. So I would recommend if you're looking into a property that only has a spring as your sole source of commercially or legal commercial irrigation water, I would ask a water master to come check on it and tell you whether or not they think that that's a valid spring before investing in that property, either as a lease or a purchase agreement, whatever you're doing, because we've seen more folks have kind of more nuanced situations with springs over the last year than we thought in the past. Also, you are allowed to collect rainwater from structures on your farm. I know some municipalities have rules about collecting rainwater, but if you are out in a rural place, you're in an unincorporated area. I live in unincorporated Lane County. If you're out in unincorporated some county in Oregon, you are allowed to collect rainwater from structures on your farm. Really, structures might be the wrong word. It's impermeable membranes. So the key here is that you don't want that rainwater to ever have the opportunity to interact with a natural system. So if it touches the ground, you are not allowed to use that as commercial irrigation water. But if it's flowing, off your house, off your barn, off your greenhouse, off of possibly a tarped, bermed impermeable membrane reservoir pond, we'll talk about that in a moment. And it never has a chance. There's no inflow, there's no outflow, and it comes off of that impermeable membrane and straight into a storage container. You are allowed to use that water for commercial irrigation. That can be a great supplemental irrigation source if you are doing some of these other things as well. A lot of exempt systems rely on combining some of these options. So you are allowed to collect rainwater as long as you're outside of the city limits of any municipality who might have an ordinance about it. Other things that we get questions about a lot, water storage. So if you are storing water that is coming from a qualified exempt source, so you're storing gray water, you're storing rainwater, you're buying in water from a water supply company like the water truck coming, you are allowed to store that water. You don't need to have a storage water right. You only need to have a storage water right if you are getting water from a groundwater source or a surface water source that you don't have a right to. But if you're using one of these qualified exempt sources, storing that water is not a problem. I will say that we have heard that some water masters around the state are helping people set up systems where they could have a rainwater reservoir where you have all of the sides are bermed and the impermeable membrane, the pond liner goes up and over those bermed sides, so there is no inflow, there is no outflow, and all of that water that's in that reservoir never had a chance to interact with a natural system. Um, but I do want to caution you, and something I've learned to say throughout these presentations is that open reservoirs can have additional insurance burdens for your farm. It's kind of the same concept of having to inform your insurance company if you put in a swimming pool, you might have to put up a fence, make sure small children don't fall into it. It could be a hazard. So make sure to inform your insurance company if you do um, pursue that direction. I would also highly recommend getting your water master involved at the planning stage if you plan on having a rainwater catchment reservoir, because the worst thing that could happen is you undertaking a tens of thousands of dollar earth moving project with all of these materials and equipment, and then you get done, you invite the water master to come look at it, and it doesn't meet their specifications and they say you can't use it. So I would highly recommend, if that's what you're wanting to go for, that you involve your water master in the planning stage to make sure that it meets their qualifications, because this is kind of a new tactic, and there aren't a ton of standardized qualifications for that. We've just heard that some water masters around the state are exploring this option with folks as an exempt system. Collecting foraged plants for sale from your property. So you're not intentionally watering that wild plant. That's just a plant that occurs on your property. We hear about this with folks who forage mushrooms on their property, folks who forage, things like stinging nettle or other edible plants that you can then sell. You do not need a water right to forage wild plants, even if they're occurring naturally on your property. You don't need a water right, and you can sell those. That is a-okay. Do keep in mind that if you are not the owner of the property, you do need permission from the landholder to do commercial foraging on their property. And if it's public land, there are permits that you need to fill out, but they're relatively cheap and easy to do. But keep that in mind. But yeah, you don't need a water right to collect foraged plants. And dry farming. We're going to talk about the Dry Farm Institute in a couple of slides, but especially if you're in the Willamette Valley, they are a wonderful resource, and they do have test plots around the valley. So I would recommend, if you're interested in learning more about dry farming, get in touch with the Dry Farm Institute, go to one of their field days, and learn more about that. We're also going to talk about some resources from OSU Extension for dry farm evaluation in a couple of slides. So dry farming is essentially just farming without irrigation. So you're creating a system on your farm, or creating conditions that allow soil to retain more moisture and allow plants to grow without regular irrigation through the dry season. So if you are just creating conditions on your property to benefit the plants that you then harvest, you're not intentionally irrigating those. So that's a-okay. You're allowed to do that. This also applies if you are just working with the natural system on your land. I had somebody ask me about whether or not, like, oh, there's kind of this swampy bit in my area or in my land. It retains water during the summer, and as long as it's not a protected wetland, you could be, this person asked about willows, and they wanted to commercially harvest willow whips and dry them to make baskets or furniture or what have you. As long as you're not irrigating that area and you're just taking advantage of the natural system that occurs there, a-okay, you can do that. I do want to clarify that if you want to use a pond for commercial irrigation, you likely will need a surface water permit, because ponds, even if they're lined, are often not like bermed, and there is inflow from surface water that, when rain comes down and it flows along the dirt surface, it touches dirt before it goes into the pond. that would mean that you would need a surface water permit to use that for commercial irrigation. So please keep that in mind. We get a lot of questions about ponds. If there's any opportunity for that water to interact with a natural system, it is considered surface water. Okay, so that is exemptions. So those are all the things that you can do without a water right. But now we're going to talk about how to get a water right and what your options are. Transfers are a wonderful, wonderful option because the benefit here is that you maintain the priority date of that water right when you do a transfer. Because if you apply for a new water right now, one, you're probably going to be awarded less water, and two, you're going to have a 2024 priority date on there, which, I mean, actually, you're probably going to have a 2026 priority date on it if you apply today. So water right transfers are definitely something that you should look into. If you were, going through the water rights mapping tool and you identified some of the properties around you that have water rights, and you know your neighbors and you know that they're not using their water right currently, I would definitely consider applying, talking to them about a transfer. And there are two types of transfers. So temporary transfers, it's just what they say, temporary. They can be for up to 5 years, so that 5-year use it or lose it period. They have the fastest paperwork. When I say that's a relative term, fastest, we do know that OWRD has quite a backlog, and new water rights applications can take on average about 2 years to be processed, even if you're denied. And temporary transfers are something that can be processed in a few months. So that is a relatively short period of time. And so if you're listening to this presentation and you're thinking, oh my God, I need an option for next season, what do I do? Consider a transfer. That's something that could be up and running by next growing season. And permanent transfers, so temporary transfers, they can be for up to 5 years. The water right holder gets to determine on the paperwork how many years the transfer is for. And at the end of that period, it reverts back to the original property. You can renew it. It doesn't mean you can't renew it, but it does go back and you'd have to file the paperwork again. Permanent transfers do permanently transfer that water right to a new property. It becomes part of the new property's deeded rights. You're allowed to use that. Something to consider with transfers is that you do have to prove that you are taking from the same source of water. So if this is a surface water right, you are not likely to get approved for a transfer if you don't have access to the same surface water source. You would have to be on that same river or creek or what have you in order to get a transfer there. And if you are doing groundwater, you do have to prove that you are hydraulically connected to the same water that that original water right is drawing from. So I would very much caution folks to understand the costs associated with this application before going down this road or putting all of your faith in this one option, because you probably will have to hire a hydrogeologist to prove that you are hydraulically connected if in the case of a groundwater transfer. So just be aware of that, and that could slow down your application process, to make sure that you are proving that you're accessing that same water. Also, there is with transfers, you do have to prove that this is active to initiate a transfer. So I live right outside Junction City, and I live in an area where there are a lot of people around me who have water rights. I don't have water rights. And my property is zoned rural, but I'm right on the city limits. And the property across the street from me, I looked up in OWRD's system, and there is a water right associated with a non-canceled water right associated with the property across the street from me. And I thought to myself, I know they're not using it because that property is now an apartment complex. And I thought, there's no chance they're using it. So I'm going to see if I can apply for a transfer. And so I called OWRD to make some inquiries about what I would need to start that process so I could approach the landowner of the property across the street from me. And they said, oh, no can do. You cannot initiate that transfer because we know that that apartment complex has been there for more than 5 years. So if that property is either paved over or heavily forested, you're going to have a really hard time proving that that has been used for a beneficial purpose in the last 5 years, is what we've been told from OWRD. But otherwise, if you're looking for proof, There are many, many sources of aerial photography that are free and available to the public. I mean, there's a free Google Earth that you can look through. And if you can find a photo of your property with green grass in August, from an aerial photo, that is considered proof because we all know how the climate is here, and you're very unlikely to have a large open field be completely green in August without irrigation. So it can be as simple as that to provide proof, but you do need to have proof of that beneficial use before you can initiate the transfer. Although you don't have to have proof of that beneficial use for that property owner to start using the right away. We have heard from one of the water masters that we've talked to that you should just start using your right and then initiate the transfer next year. So if that property owner doesn't plan on farming, ask if you can lease some of their land to establish beneficial use and then initiate the transfer the next year. That could be a pathway to a transfer for you. Okay, next thing to talk about is limited licenses. So I don't know if you all are aware, I wasn't aware until I started this process, but you can apply for a temporary water right. So this is not a transfer, it's a brand new water right, but it only lasts for 5 years. So this is called a limited license. It is usually to establish a crop that requires no further irrigation after the crop is established, or road construction or emergency use. But so if you are looking to establish some kind of perennial dry farmable system, like if you wanted to do hazelnuts or orchard fruit or some kind of perennial caneberry or bushberry that would not require regular irrigation if you design the system correctly, but you need that water to get yourself started, consider a limited license. This is a good tool for getting those long-term crops established. Keep in mind though that you are very, very, very unlikely to get that renewed. So it's not like you can just renew a limited license and get another one and get another one. It's very unlikely for that to be renewed. If I think that there's a case to be made if there is a huge devastating event that wipes out your entire crop, like a huge ice storm or a huge hurricane or something that would wipe out your entire crop in year 4.5 of that 5-year period. But barring a disaster like that, you are probably not going to get that renewed after the 5-year period. You can apply through the OWRD website. And all of you who registered for this workshop tonight, we will be sending you this PowerPoint so you can click all the links that I have here as well. So that's limited licenses. But can't you just apply for a new water right? And that's the answer that was given to a lot of the folks who received letters in the first round of, in notifications that they were operating illegally that went out at the end of last year. They were told, well, why don't you just apply for a new water right? And you can apply. The applications are open on OWRD's website. This system has been over appropriated for quite a while. And what we mean by over appropriated, I know some folks are sitting there thinking, well, we have plenty of water in my community. How could it be over appropriated? It's all the water rights. Think about all of the water rights in the system as tickets to a movie. And if every single person who had a ticket to a movie, a ticket to this movie showed up to the showing, there would not be enough seats. We would not have enough water to go around. Even if there is water in the system, somebody has claim to it. And there are some water rights that are going unused, some people who are not showing up to the movie. And so it might appear that the system has more water available than it does. So that's what they mean by over appropriated, that there are more tickets out there than seats in the theater. But we know that not every person who has a ticket is coming to the theater for their movie viewing pleasure. So, but that means that the system is over appropriated. And so on paper, water is probably not available in most basins in Oregon. Also, your new rights will be very junior. And if they're surface water rights, you will be shut off first when levels drop. There are also, I should say that there have recently been new groundwater allocation rules approved that we'll talk about in the groundwater section that will make it more expensive and difficult to apply for a groundwater right that you all should be aware of when you're making your decisions. Okay, so there are 4 types of water rights that we're going to talk about in this section. Surface water rights, we've talked about surface water. It's water that flows over the surface of the earth that interacts with natural systems. So it touches dirt. So surface water rights are hard to come by for traditional irrigation months. So about March to October, we have heard of folks who are getting irrigation water rights for surface water who are October to March. So in off season, but you have to have the storage capacity to deal with that. So if that's something that your water master is willing to work with you on, that could be a possibility if you have the storage capacity to handle that. Yeah, so that's the winter storage that I'm talking about there. But keep in mind that you might also need to apply for a storage water right if you do that. Please refer to your water master before pursuing this. In general, before applying for water rights, we would highly encourage you to talk to your water master, and they will give you a pretty honest assessment about whether or not water is available in the form that you're looking for it. So groundwater rights, much like surface water rights, are difficult to obtain in many aquifers. The new rules essentially they require you, my understanding of the new rules is that they require you to prove that there is adequate water resources for what you're asking for, and that there is not a hydraulic connection between the surface water and groundwater in the area. And also the first part of that used to be something that the department, the OWRD, would evaluate. Now that burden of proof is on the applicant. And so you will need to hire a geohydrologist to do some surveys and figure out what's there and make your case. It's not something that the department is going to evaluate. You have to make the case to prove it yourself in the application process, which means that this is going to be much more expensive than in the past. So keep that in mind if you're thinking about applying for groundwater rights. Yeah, be prepared to hire experts for assessments and surveys, and talk to your water master before pursuing this. Because again, they will know whether or not water rights are being granted in your area and what conditions the water rights that have been granted in your area have been under. So they can give you more information about how not to waste your time and money. Because like I said, these water right applications, the standard wait time is about 2 years is what we've heard. And it is a several $1,000 process. So just making sure that you're aware of the resources going into that. You can also apply for storage water rights. So you need that if you're storing water that originated in a stream, touched the bare ground, or is groundwater that you are pumping out for the first purpose of storing that water. In some cases, we talked about this with rainwater, you could have a rainwater storage and collection reservoir. So we've heard of this with high berms on all sides and an impermeable membrane that goes over those berms. So no inflow, no outflow. And again, we want to emphasize that we would really, really recommend getting your water master involved in that process to make sure it's going to meet their requirements when they come to inspect your finished project. So you're not in a position where you invested in all of this infrastructure and then can't use it. Appropriation of stored water from a reservoir. So this is another type of water right. I'm going to be honest with you that I know that this is a type of water right. It has been mentioned to me by water masters, but I don't fully understand all the situations in which you would need this water right. One of them could be there are current water rights available from some Army Corps of Engineers reservoirs. If you have one of those in your area, I would look into it. The only thing about that is that you cannot, just throw a pipe in it and have that pipe go all the way to your property. You are going to have to invest in renting or buying a water truck to get your allocated water out of that Army Corps of Engineers reservoir. But that is something that is available that I've heard from various communities around the state that is a viable option. So sometimes you will need this type of water right to use water stored, the storage water right, and make sure that you talk to your water master and make sure that they don't recommend that you get one of these as well. This should be part of that overall conversation with your water master about what your options are before submitting an application. Okay, so that is my overview of current law, what your options are. And I hope that that generated some questions that we will answer at the end. Okay, what can we do? So what resources are available to you? So we have community resources to change growing practices, and then we have the possibility of legislative change, which we'll talk about in the next section. I want to highlight some community resources for adaptation. Selfishly, I'd like to highlight the Friends of Family Farmers program, the Oregon Pasture Network. We have several classes on warm season pasture renovation. We've partnered with OSU scientists and researchers, as well as farmers who've been doing this for decades, to talk about warm season pasture renovation, to make sure that you have options to reduce your pasture irrigation burden and keep your forage greener so that your animals have more to eat throughout the warm season and you don't need to rely on pasture irrigation. So check out the Oregon Pasture Network if you're interested in that and you're a pastured livestock producer. The Dry Farming Institute, I mentioned them earlier, but they are a great resource. They have public programs that show you sites that are outfitted well for dry farming. They also have test sites, and if you are a Dry Farm Institute test site, then you will get they'll give you parameters and instructions on how to grow. They'll give you seed. You are allowed to keep and sell the produce as long as you contribute to quality and yield data and participate in the research. So that's a really cool option if you are able to connect with them and become a test site. I think like connecting with them in the winter obviously is a good idea because you would be planting in the spring. So reaching out to the Dry Farming Institute could be a good option. Extension can be a great resource, and we're going to talk about them in the next slide. I think something that I have heard many times is that people aren't sure if they're allowed to talk to Extension if they have recently learned that they are operating outside of the law. Extension is not a government agency. They are not required to report you for illegal use of water. They can help you design an exempt system to get out of that situation. But if you have a friendly extension agent in your area, like I don't want you all to worry about that reporting requirement. That's not legally required, but it does kind of depend on your extension agent. The Quivira Coalition is a wonderful group out of New Mexico that has a lot of arid land farming information. Some of it is based on the acequia system that they have down there, but a lot of it is, universally applicable, and they know a lot about arid land farming. And the last thing, well, the second to last thing, because there's one that I keep forgetting to add to this slide, is the Oregon Community Food Systems Network. So the OCFSN is a nonprofit organization that was awarded some funding from the state to hand out to small farmers and ranchers for climate resilience and drought resilience and climate-based disaster resilience. And water storage and irrigation projects are part of some of the eligible projects that you could apply for that funding for. And that next funding cycle, the next grant applications will open on November 15th. So if you are interested in getting some infrastructure to make changes to your system on your farm, or to reduce your irrigation burden or try to do more with the water that you have, please do consider applying to the Oregon Community Food System Farmer Rancher Disaster Relief or Resilience Program that will, if you sign up for our newsletter, you will get a notification about it, or if you sign up for OCFSN's newsletter. The last one that I keep forgetting to add to the slide is your Soil and Water Conservation District. Different soil and water conservation districts across the state have varying levels of staff, but they all do have the goal of helping you do the most for resource conservation. And so if you are able to connect with your SWCD, they can help you access programs, they can give you some education. Oftentimes they can come do a site evaluation with you and talk about your individual problems, but I'd really encourage you to get in touch with your SWCD staff and see what they can tell you. So extension folks have asked me to highlight 3 things that extension can do for you. If you are in a system where you need to find an alternative to domestic exempt well water, They can come out and evaluate your site for dry farming potential, maybe identify some portions of your property that might meet requirements or be good for dry farming. They can give you options within exemptions to meet your goals. So they can look at, what structures you have on your property, your average rainfall, help you get a feeling for how much rainwater you could potentially gather, or how much gray water you could gather, and help you design a cropping system that might be able to stay within that realm. Then they also have direct lines to many of the government grant and loan programs, a lot of which are coming down through the Inflation Reduction Act for conservation practices, small farms, community food systems. There's a lot of buzzwords happening in that realm right now. And your OSU Extension folks might know about programs that you don't. And they are a great resource to help you connect to other government sponsored programs to get you money to make adaptations, as well as technical assistance resources. But, check it out. So that's what OSU Extension can do for you if you reach out to them on this topic. Okay, so those are some great options if you are in a position to make changes to your operation to adapt to what I've told you about legal and illegal water use from domestic exempt wells. FOF is also trying to pursue some legislative change. We are still in the legislative concept development phase of this process, and we are very excited to get feedback from y'all about some of the things that we are talking about, including in a proposal for 2025. So this is a 2025 priority for FOF. We identified this through the focus groups and surveys. We do have a champion identified, and we're in the legislative concept development phase. Our champion, Senator Golden, who's the chair of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, which is where this bill probably would have been assigned to anyway, so it's great that he is the person who's heading this up for us. He has put in what we call a placeholder bill, so it's kind of an empty bill related to domestic exempt well water. And we are working with some of the partners listed here, as well as reaching out to water conservation groups who are very nervous about this concept, to try to find a path forward that can both respect our limited resources and to give small and beginning farmers a pathway. Because to FOF, this issue is not just about the fact that water rights are hard to come by. It's the fact that because water rights are hard to come by, this has become an economic equity issue, and by extension, because of the socioeconomic conditions in our country and our state, especially with the history of land tenure, this has unequal impacts across identities. And so this is a land access issue, in addition to whether or not we're deciding who's allowed to grow food in this state. And I'll say more about that in a moment, but things that we're considering, we put some possible solutions on the table. Possible solution components include a gallon per day limit, probably close to what the current commercial exemption is, usage reporting and annual registration with OWRD, including a fee, or removing the word commercial from the half-acre exemption. That's also something that's been floated to us. In general, I think we are more inclined to want to incentivize conservation by having a gallon per day limit for folks to do the most that they can with, so that, and also to know how much water people are using. But all things are on the table still. We've also been floated exclusions for critical groundwater areas and cannabis production as things that, if you're in a critical groundwater area, or if it's for cannabis production, it would not be included in these exemptions. So those are some components. And I think, I have a little bit more information, and then we'll open it up and we'll take questions on the presentation and then feedback on the legislative concepts in that order. So when we talk about 5,000 gallons per day for the commercial exemption, how much water are we talking about? 5,000 gallons a day is 35,000 gallons a week, which is 1.3 acre inches per week. And annual vegetable production recommends 1 inch of water per week in the high season. So the hottest part of the year, you're really requiring 1 inch of water to make those annual veg crops like tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and the things that everybody loves at the farmer's market. Those things generally require 1 inch of water per week. So 5,000 gallons is enough to do 1.3 acres at 1 inch per week. And when we talk about groundwater restricted areas, just to give folks an idea of where those are in the state, these are designated by Oregon Water Resources Department, OWRD. And you can see the red areas are critical groundwater areas. So these are places where they're in very big trouble. Their water table is collapsing. And the classified areas are places that are under management plans, but are not currently in as dire of a situation as the red areas. This whole green area, the upper Deschutes, they have a special management plan because of the Deschutes River Basin's particular geology and the usage patterns in that area, and they have a different mitigation strategy and usage plan than anywhere else in the state, so they get their own color on this map. But that's some context for when we say excluding critical groundwater areas, we're talking about these red areas here. And if you would like to sign a petition to encourage legislators to fix this in any way and to prioritize this issue, we'll put this up at the end. But I think now we're ready for questions. I'll leave it on the campaign thing, but yeah, Brittany, would you like to read out